Buenos días.
Good afternoon,
En
everyone.
primer lugar, deseo darle las gracias a las autoridades del coloquio de idea.
First, I want to thank the authorities of the IDEA colloquium for this mistake of having invited me.
En primer lugar, deseo también felicitarlos por la elección.
In the first place, I also want to congratulate them for the choice of the name of this colloquium,
Donde la referencia del si no es ahora cuándo está tomado
its motivation, where the reference of, if it is not now, when I am taken I do not know if they know it or not, but of the book of Pirkei Avot, 1:14,
si yo no estoy para mí, ¿quién está para mí? Y aunque esté para mí solo,
which refers to Hillel, and says, he used to say that if I am not for me, who is for me, and even if I am for me, what am I only for me?
porque, digamos, es ahora.
What I am going to do is tell Argentina as a business case.
Porque esta vez es diferente. Y después voy a presentar directamente a Argentina como un caso de inversión.
Why it is now, and, basically, I will make a first part where I will explain why, this time, it is different, and then I will present directly to Argentina as a case of investment.
Justamente es una narración de que cuántas veces se dijo que esta vez va a ser diferente y siempre terminó de la
Basically,
misma manera.
one should ask why this time will be different. In fact, Reinhart and Rogoff's book, precisely, it is a narrative that how many times it was said that, this time, it will be different and always ended in the same way.
Un cambio estructural y un cambio que inicie una nueva era.
In the Argentine case, it always ended badly.
Trabajaban para que esta vez fuera diferente. Y vaya que lo lograron.
So it is a little more challenging to explain why.
De ser un país de bárbaros en 35 años nos convertimos en la primera potencia mundial.
This time, it will be different, but it is also true that, at some point, there may be a change of trend, a structural change and a change that starts a new era. In fact, the generation of 37 precisely
Esta vez es diferente, no podemos dejar de lado las condiciones iniciales con las que nos hemos enfrentado. Porque también la forma
worked so that this time it was different than what they succeeded, because when, in 1860, the Constitution was launched, of Alberty, of being a country of barbarians, in 35 years we become the first world power.
combinaba los peores elementos de las tres crisis más grandes de la historia argentina. Teníamos un desequilibrio monetario.
So the central idea of this presentation is to show you why that is feasible and why, this time, it can be different.
Cuando el Banco Central se quedó sin dólares y no le
Naturally, to explain why this time it is different, we cannot ignore the initial conditions we have faced, because also the way we have resolved this makes the argument that, this time, it will be different.
2.400. Por otra parte, cuando uno toma
Basically, we, at the time of assuming, we faced what, potentially, was the worst crisis in Argentine history, which combined the worst elements of the three greatest crises in Argentine history.
y al mismo tiempo los indicadores sociales eran
We had a monetary surplus imbalance, the money overhang that was twice as much as we had in Rodrigazo.
y que cualquier error hubiera detonado.
Consider, at that time, when the central bank ran out of dollars and had no choice but to open and devalue, the inflation rate multiplied for 6 times. If it was double, imagine that we had been traveling to 200% and we were going to 1200 base, and if it was double to 2400. On the other hand, when one takes the situation from the central bank, in terms of paid liabilities, with respect to the monetary base, the situation was much worse than the one the central bank, at the beginning of the '89 prior to the hyperinflation of Alfonsín, which ended in 5,000%, and, at the same time, the social indicators were worse than we had in the previous one of the burst of the convertibility. Therefore, it is clear that the situation was extremely complex and that any error had detonated a crisis of proportions very difficult to imagine, but that, in the light of what they were, each of these crises, it is not difficult to imagine that, at least, poverty would have doubled. Therefore, we would have been at levels, at least, of 90% or a little more, and surely half of the homeless population. The basic symptom of all this was reflected in what was the inflation rate. Here there is always a discussion of whether it is valid or not being making annualizations. From my point of view it is valid, because it is to the rhythm that prices were moving and there were elements that allowed a monetary validation that, indeed, would validate them in the facts. Moreover, the day we took charge of the administration, in that opening speech, I explained how the account was made. So, and I really did that, from the monetary, because, in fact, I did not yet had the fact, for example, of what was the wholesale price index of December, for example. In that sense, in the first week, December, prices were traveling to 1% daily, which is 3,700% per year. When you looked, the second week, there had been an acceleration and prices began to travel to the rhythm of 7,500. And when you take wholesale inflation, and I always work with wholesale inflation, because it is usually an indicator leader, that is, it is usually advanced to what happens with retail inflation, and that month gave 54%. That, in annualized terms, is 17,000%. Therefore, there is no doubt that if this had exploded we would be talking about an absolutely different situation. So the first thing that, clearly, we had to finish was with inflation. Here, without a doubt, it is always key to have a good diagnosis and, fortunately, thanks to that huge team that I have, which leads Toto Caputo, we could give it an accurate blow from the first moment, and we started on the hypothesis that inflation is, always and everywhere, a monetary phenomenon, generated by an excessive supply of money, either because the demand falls, because the offer goes up, or because the two things happen, which derive in a loss of the purchasing power of money and, consequently, all prices, expressed in monetary units go up. Notice that in the definition that I use about the origin of inflation and how I look at inflation, I do not define it as the general rise in prices, but as the loss of the purchasing power of money. That is, I do not have that bad habit of many politicians who believe it is the fault of entrepreneurs who put high prices. I still remember my predecessor in office, which said that inflation is produced by the devils, and the forces of the sky killed them all. That own definition of widespread prices is what allows, some outdated, believes that this is fixed with price controls, when that never worked in the history of mankind, and if there is a place where it never worked, it was never in Argentina. Then, the point was to track the origins of the monetary emission, and here it was interesting, because something else that exploded, in the eyes of anyone who looked at the Argentine case, were twin deficits. Think that when a country has 4% of the GDP of twin deficits, it is a yellow alert. 8, it is a red alert because a pineapple is being hit. We had 17, more or less, to have an order of magnitude of the challenge. Now, those 17, 15 were in the public sector, 5 in the treasury and 10 in the central bank. So, basically, the idea was to attack the public sector problem and attack the problem of the central bank. And in that context we developed the zero deficit program. I remember that when we campaigned with a chainsaw, many took it to laugh. In addition, they said it was impossible. And, in addition, if one looked at the Argentine history, it seemed quite complicated because, of the last 123 years, Argentina had a deficit in 113. The 10 that did not have is because they were default. And, in addition, when one took the amount of crisis, using the methodology of Ana Maria Cerro and Osvaldo Maloney, Argentina, from 1901 until today, he had 23 crises, where 21 have fiscal origin and where they separate between high fiscal deficit and fiscal demadmer directly. There are a lot of other things that due to inheritance, and I do not want to recharge much because I have said it in other places and I want to leave more time to discuss the Argentine case, but that which seemed virtually impossible, that could not be adjusted more than 1 point per year, that we were never going to achieve it. We did it in the first month of management. That is, the first month of management, we achieved what, in 123 years, in the Argentine economy had never been achieved. Naturally, in the face of this achievement, obviously that when it was achieved, in the first month, that by the way we also surprised ourselves, do not believe. I believe on the chainsaw, but Toto did better. There they began to question, and instead of recognizing that the mandriles were wrong, they began with that, no, it has a lot of blender and scissors, and all those little things of these boys who are not heirs of Adam Smith Shore. Yes, they don't, but, said, beyond parish jokes, basically, the first thing we did was reduce the number of ministries. From 18 to 9 today we already have 8 ministries. In addition, public works were eliminated from Rennet. They said it was impossible to touch public works, of course because politicians steal and we, as we are willing to make an honest people, the first thing we cut was public works. Another thing they said it was impossible to play because it was a great work. Among politicians were discretionary transfers to the provinces. In general, what it was about doing was making those transfers to those provinces with the most opaque accounting possible, just for, in that way, they could steal. Naturally, discretionary transfers to the provinces, outside. Another thing they said could not be done was to play public employees. Not only that we have been thrown almost 50,000 public employees, but also every time a contract falls, in most cases, it is not renewed. Therefore, we also shrink the number of public employees. Then there is a very interesting part that happened at a cabinet meeting. We were gathered and, in the middle of the meeting, Toto had to go to a meeting away from Casa Rosada. And then, he got up and stayed with the rest of the ministers, and once he finished going I asked each of the ministers and explicitly I told him that I wanted, in addition, they will cut 10% more of each of the expenses of each of the ministries. The most surprising thing is that the following week, each of the ministers brought me a program to reduce and efficient for spending, lowering public spending 10%. What is that is to have commitment to management. In addition, another thing we did and that also seemed impossible was the elimination of intermediaries, that is, to get the managers from poverty out of the environment. This was one of the battles, probably of the hardest we had to give. This was a battle that was designed with the Minister of Human Capital, Sandra Petovello, the Minister of Security, Dr. Bullrich, and Dr. Ferraro, who is Guillermo Ferraro, who was in infrastructure, where, basically, what was raised, because it was what appeared in the holder, and the reason why they criticized Minister Petovello was that the consideration of the plan was eliminated. Then they went out to criticize us saying, now, we wanted to give plans without consideration, and that what we were doing was fostering laziness, that is, as we were still worse than the populists, who had gone. And that is not to understand what happened with that. We, in the first place, were clear that, because of the type of adjustment we were doing, it was very likely that the strongest impact felt during the first quarter. Therefore, it was also important to do it during vacation, so that people did not find out so much, to put it in some way, of what was happening. On the other hand, we had to ensure that the most vulnerable sectors did not feel the force of the adjustment. So, it was very important to contain them, but the problem is that there was no money, so where we were going to get the resources? It is true that, too, we pointed an adjustment of 5 and on we have an adjustment of 7 and then we could be recomposed other items. But here it was key, which was also what fogganated and fed the pickets, which said it was impossible to end them, and that thanks to this measure and the anti-piquete protocol of that wonderful minister, which I have that, it is Dr. Bullrich. Today we live in an Argentina that has no pickets, something that also seemed impossible, and that we did it from the first day of management. In that context, something happened that all the people believed that as the beneficiaries of the plans received a card that prevented that there were intermediaries and, in reality, that did not prevent that there were intermediaries because, basically, although they charged with a card, at the time they had to leave the record that they had provided the service. At that time, it was when they charged him the toll and there it was when they took half of the plan. Then, suddenly, they had 2 plans and a plan had to be left to the piquetera hordes so that they could continue to charge the plan. And how was the benefit? Take the coupons that gave him, on the marches, that they said they had been in the marches. So one of the things we did is remove the obligation of that benefit. So what happened? People were not obliged to realize that they had done something and, therefore, without us turning a single more weight, revenues were doubled in the middle of the adjustment. But at the same time, that took resources to the piqueteras, the managers of poverty. Therefore, it was so important to have the anti-picket protocol quickly, and that is why it was very important what happened in the first battle that we were going to have. And, in that context, the transport system, instead of using it to make a negative campaign, as Massa did throughout the campaign, saying all kinds of aberrations that it is, until today, that I have to continue explaining, that they are lies, such as, for example, that I will target universities or that I want to close them because I want to privatize them. That is, then they use all that negative campaign so that they do not audit them. So, the question that I would ask you is, are you in favor of the jets and do not audit them and use universities to sharpen with politics? Because that's the question. Universities are not going to be privatized, they will continue to be public and not tariff. All we want to do is audit them, and yet I have to continue responding for this. And, in that context, a line of complaints were placed so that they would not be extorted. And, obviously, we took 18,000 troops to the street, since Bellaboni threatened with a demonstration of 50,000 and internally said that they were going to be 100,000. Thus he showed himself as a mega-excite. And the demonstration ended up being 3,000 people, and, from that day, the pickets were finished in Argentina. Well, it was a good move too. Because you have 3 types of wars. You have stock wars against stocks. You lose the one that ends first. They have wars that are flow against flow, they never end. Or have wars that are flows against stock. The silly that Argentine politics had been, in this regard, it was that, To the enemy, it was giving flow all the time. And this design between Dr. Petovello, Dr. Bullrich and Dr. Ferraro caused him to become a war of flow against stock. And we had the flow and the stock had them. They were going to do a whole strong bet and then the different marches were going to deflate. And, indeed, it is what we did. But, in the middle, we had to endure the criticisms that we were promoting laziness. So when they go for the capital, and they can travel comfortably, say, sorry, Milei. Naturally, there was also a liquefaction of salaries in the public sector and obviously that also impacted the retirements. Retirements that, today, are above 10% above inflation and above what were in November. And not only that, but also, in dollars, they tripled. That, basically, was the program of La Operara, something that was never done and we did not put with a lot of sacred cows. Because we got into public works, with transfers, we got into everything. We got into the managers of poverty. Therefore, it was not impossible. We just had to have the courage to do it and we had it. On the other hand, that only fixed 1/3 of the problem. We still had the problem of the central bank. What was the fourth fiscal deficit and that involved endogenous issuance of money and, therefore, if we wanted to cut with inflation we had to end the quasi-fiscal. There was also very important to start showing, systematically, the fiscal balance and that was something that had come to stay and that was not something transitory. Because here there is something very important. If I go to zero deficit, the increase in debt is void. Therefore, the debt-product ratio is not increasing, and if the debt-product ratio is not increasing, therefore, one is intertemporarily solvent and, sooner or later, the country risk will collapse, and we receive it about 3,000 and, today, it is fighting for breaking the 1,000. So it seems that we are also going well there, and it is not that it is going down a problem of error. Type 2, I say. It seems to me that having achieved it based on tax solvency is an achievement and very far to regret. That is why someone reads the tincture burned his brain. Then, in that cleaning, from the central bank, we had to face the issue of paid liabilities. Moreover, what were those of the LELIQs, which were instruments at 30, 60, 90, 180, 270 days. The previous government, everything had happened one day, in such a way that, if the crisis was fired, the amount of money could be multiplied by 5 in one day. Obviously, that would have implied a brutal inflationary explosion and, by the end of the year, we were no longer in power and they returned to the government. But with all the dirty work done, we did not glad. They are still eating pachotzwo, they must be thus fat. Moreover, with all that he took from the overalls, surely, he will be able to become very round. So, there we also gave a very important battle at the beginning because what suggested us much of the profession? And it was that we rose the interest rate, that we would take it to positive field, the real interest rate, and the reality is that if we had done that, today, we would be discussing a passive monetary relationship against the base of more than 10 times. And we would be discussing the carry trade and we would be arguing when we would be about to fly through the air and we would be discussing that inflation does not lower because the expectation of emission, remunerated or future emission, consequently it never went down, which would have been a huge mistake. There is, obviously, a discussion about using or not using the interest rate. I commented, at the last meeting of the central bank. But what we decided was to arbitrate the dollar rate, given the jump of the exchange rate, which was not, neither more nor, than a sincereness because it causes me to grace the intellectual dishonesty of some saying, No, Milei arrived and devalue, as if the gap did not exist and as if the central bank was to burst of reservations. That is, there are truly people who do not know if you don't hear, do not read what you write. You can't be so dishonest intellectually. But when arbitrating the rate, in dollars, and in a stabilization process, and with a price sincere was obvious that the interest rate in pesos, even being negative in real terms, which could be arbitrated with the dollar rate, and that at the same time allowed us to liquefy the paid liabilities. And in the meantime we continued to consolidate the fiscal balance. And when the solidity of the fiscal balance was clear, there began a huge task of the Secretary of Finance, Pablo Cornó, in conjunction with the central bank, where they began to remove the paid liabilities from the balance of the central bank and began to go where it should always have gone, which was in the treasure. Because, deep down, those paid liabilities arose from having generated fiscal deficit, of having financed it with monetary issuance and that by another window get it paying fees. So that the fiscal problem made him a problem of future inflation, and that, which is also interesting because no one said how to solve it, the answers when he raised this were absolutely ridiculous and nobody knew how to solve it. Well, we solved it in 6 months and the 7th month ended with the 4th fiscal deficit. Something that seemed impossible, we also made it possible. After we managed to close the tap of the paid liabilities, we move on to the scheme of excess supply of zero money. I remember that I presented it in the stock exchange and explained that only then we were going to buy dollars. That is, the only source of issuance that was going to stay was the purchase of dollars. And one of the things we realized is that we were wrong with that scheme. If you take the traditional books of the international monetary economy, you will find that when someone goes and sells the dollars, or in other words, buy weights from the central bank, that has a demand for money and does not generate inflation. That is true in a world where there are no capital controls. When you have capital controls, you go and buy pesos not because you want, but because you are forced, and, therefore, it is differential between what you would like to have and what you are actually buying, is what generates pressure on the price level. And in front of a speculative attack, where the dollar quoted at $1,500 and anticipated that a week, which was still going to $2,000 and so on, we decided to change the monetary scheme and go directly to zero emission. It seems that something also worked and happened that never happened in Argentina, and that is that the dollar of 1,500 fell to 1,100. So, what also seems impossible, we also made it possible. So the result of all this is that wholesale inflation, which was in 54%, that is, annualized in 17,000. Yesterday, retail inflation, the last fact was known, and basically the September inflation was 2%, that is, that having inflation in 17,000 we took to 28%, and they have no doubt that we will continue to fall. In addition, it is also very interesting how this was achieved because this also makes this time different. Because we did not have a previous hyperinflation that implied a deep license of financial assets so that the stabilization was fast. We also achieve it without an expropriation, that is, we do not resort to the violence of a Bonex plan, or a compulsive renegotiation or a default or any equivalent. That is why when they said, when do they finish cleaning the paid? And I don't know, the answer is, I am not a leaders, I am liberal. And this is a market process and we will end up cleaning the market. Allow us to pass them to another instrument. Therefore, this is also a novelty for what the Argentine economy is, which we did without expropriating and without default. Another important feature is that all this is doing without controlling prices, which also makes a big difference. On the other hand, we also did it without fixing the exchange rate, because if one fixes the exchange rate, this occurs faster. And as if all this were not enough, we did it in a recomposition of relative prices. The previous government had left very late prices and we are recomposing them, and today, prices cover more than 80% of the costs. Therefore, this is truly a different way to lower inflation to how it was done in the previous programs in the Argentine case. And as if all this were not enough, one could say, but what happened in terms of activity? Look at the most similar program, in terms of adjustment, which was done in Argentina, much less than this, but of important magnitude, was what happened with DUHAD in 2002. That year, the GDP fell 10.9%, and in the second quarter, which is when the adjustment entered, the economy fell 16%. Moreover, Vice Minister Daza said that all strong adjustment experiences, not like the one we did, but of important adjustments, in each of those cases the GDP had fallen, at least 10%. I tell you that, if we take the last data of the endless EMAE, and compare it with November-December, the fall is, just, of 0.6%. If you want to look in industry, with the last data it is already at the same levels as November. That is, there was a negative impact on the first quarter, and it has already begun to be revealed. Therefore, in addition, the economic program was so well designed that, in addition, it implied not having to suffer strongly in terms of activity and, today, and the use of installed capacity is already above what we had last year. But not everything was stabilization, that is, not only a stabilization program was made, but also a set of structural reforms in between the DNU 70/23 and the base law made a reform 8 times larger than that made by Menem, but with the situation that the reform, which made Menem, was the greatest Argentine history. Therefore, I want them to have a historical awareness that we are living a government which made the largest structural reform in Argentine history. That is different too. And what does that imply? It implies that we are going to jump 90 positions in terms of economic freedom, and those countries that are freer are 12 times richer than repressed. They have 25 times less poor in the standard format and 50 times less in the extreme format, and that we are walking to institutions that today could compare with those it has. Germany, France, Italy, any of the countries of Europe. Therefore, in fact, in the Juan Pablo Nicolini days he presented a work on, for example, of maintaining fiscal balance, with that we would have a potential to double the GDP in 10 years, that is, a rate of GDP growth of 7%. And as if all this were not enough, I have a luxury of minister, which is El Coloso, Federico Sturzenegger, which every day dysregulates something. That is, there is no day that Federico does not make me happy. The day when I read his Twitter account. Thanks, Federico. And now is when I'm going to start selling the Argentine case, because once I speak of Riggi, I will put Argentina as if it were a business. There I took active participation in the format of Riggi, so if they do not like Riggi they can whistle me with all the chain, because I was deeply involved and put the hands inside, so all the fingers are marked. They will see all the dirty fingers. I have everything. So, now, I'm going to tell you what things I got into. So if that is what they strip, know what my fault is. One of the things we explicitly put in Riggi was the respect of the financial economic equation of the business. That is, the financial economic equation of the business is the account that you use for when you calculate the value of a company. That is, if you had a regulated company, for example, and that basically what is done to a regulated company is void the quasi-renta, it implies that it will have a return similar to the opportunity cost, which in a regulated company also regulates the UAP, so to speak. And in that sense, for example, in the case of a regulated company, you look for a price path as zero, in such a way that you can rewrite it in terms of the necessary income to cover the cost of operation and maintenance, the fiscal cost and the remuneration of capital. That is, they are different ways of describing that same equation. But the most interesting thing about that equation is that they have an element that allows quantifying the effects of the atrocities that the state can cause, whether taxes, whether it modifies or believes new taxes or modify TAP. We did it the first day and it is working. So, incorporating the financial economic equation of a business makes every time the state or a government wants to make fiscal policy harming the private sector, the cost of the account will be much larger than the positive it can generate. Therefore, we are binding them to future politicians, we too, but not as we do not want to do that kind of thing. Notice this, we are going to a 0 and 0 broadcasting scheme in an electoral year. Can you tell me what politician in the world has done that in the history of humanity? Because from my point of view it never happened. At the same time, another thing we put in Riggy, in the original version there was the election of 3 courts. So, you could choose one of those 3 courts. In those 3 courts, the modification that occurred to me to do to me is that one elected a court, but when he runs time he is not happy with that court can change it. In other words, they have flexibility, that, if a court does not answer, change court. That is, the fuck of politicians will expropriating the creators of wealth. It will end with that, because if you do not respond a court they will go to another. But also that did not reach me. I wanted a little more. I was quite insatiable that day. It seems. It will be because I come from the private sector. And another thing that occurred to me was to add a local court. Because when one looks at the experience of other cases, international courts always demanded a lot of time and, on the other hand, with local courts that flows much faster. Now, that local court is obliged to take the results generated by the defense of competence and defense of competition will have a special unit for Riggy. And those who are the ones that follow the Riggy contracts, the situations of Riggy, will have to know of a micro, will have to know of macro, they will have to know about loan economics, they will have to know of law, they will also have to know of finance and, especially, of evaluation of companies and economic regulation. And they will have to. Now there will be an income exam everywhere, but that exam will be designed by some notables and me. That is, I am not the remarkable. The remarkable, the notables are Federico Sturzenegger, Toko Caputo, Santiago Bossoli, and I will put an additional evil, which will be a unit aimed at caring for investors, which will always be able to opt for the local court under these characteristics. Why do I say this? Because already entering Argentina, proper. If you wanted to value a project you will be looking at the flow of funds. Now, background flow, wonderful. But you can have a phenomenal business. But if the state or a government comes later and expropriates them, the mechanism does not work. That is, it is very important, probably one of the most important institutions together with respect for life and freedom, is property right. Not for nothing, in this year's sessions, we said it was life, freedom and property. And here private property will be respected. Rajatabla will be respected, because what will allow is that savers can save and will be defended. In fact, the way in which we disarm the situation of the central bank was to respect the property right, and that also implies that we are not going to advance on the investment results. For us, the one who earns money is not evil. For us, the one who earns money is a social benefactor. That is, it is a hero. That is, it is someone who is fixing your life, because you can only be successful serving the neighbor with better quality or best price goods. Therefore, we far from chasing him, we are going to celebrate, we will applaud them. And in that situation where we respect the savings, respect the investment, respect the property rights, that is what will lead to a process of capital accumulation in per capita terms that will raise the productivity of the Argentines, and it will make us all richer. Therefore, that, clearly, is not negotiable, like none of the basic parts of my program, as they will have seen. Because when he said that if the degenerates of prosecutors did things that damaged the fiscal balance, they told you, it will not be encouraged. Come on, tell me if I did not encourage. But, apart from that, another of the things I want to mention is, well, then you are going to choose a sector. You will imagine that being liberal I will not be getting into encouraging something, particularly, don't pick the winners. This is very interesting because, on many occasions, the occasional transnochado says, but it has no program, it has no stabilization program. And what lowered inflation from 54 to 2? That, incidentally, induced inflation too, right? I say, wait for us to arrive and achieve it in consumer and let's see what happens to the stock. After, they already know, obvious, that they know. But, said that, from our perspective, a stabilization program has 3 legs: a fiscal policy, a monetary policy and an exchange policy. In the fiscal, zero deficit. In the monetary, zero issuance and currency competition, which is already happening. In order for those who have great fears for the exchange rate appreciation, do not worry, we are allowing the supply and demand of dollars to mop themselves by individuals, therefore, they will not have an abrupt fall of the exchange rate that is so fast that they do not allow them to adjust in the real sector and end in bankruptcy. He is contemplated, but not afraid. Now they can make transactions in dollars and in any other currency. So mood, that is not a problem, and or stop being scared by economists who seem to die with dinosaurs and resurrect and maintain the same habit as dinosaurs. Apart from ESO, it is clear that in Argentina they have sectors that are very interesting, which I also suggest that they put it when they do the real exchange rate analysis. That is, the issue of real exchange rate is quite debatable, but it seems more questionable to when they cut the series. Why do they cut the series in 2002 or 2003? Why don't they cut it in 91? No, because there it will give it very down, so they cannot come with, no, there is a real exchange problem. That is, with which, from the problem that implies when they choose the date it is not a minor issue. But still, I warn you, with everything that is happening in energy matters, with everything that has to do with oil and gas, it is most likely that Argentina goes, without a doubt, at a much more appreciated currency level. That is, why? Because there are huge opportunities in oil and gas issues that, clearly, respecting property rights, investments will appear, and in fact, Rigi already has ads for more than $50,000 million of investments and many companies are already investing. Moreover, many of the companies are already placing debt below 8% in dollars, and Pampa same did it to 5.75. Therefore, prepare because a tremendous wave of dollars from that place is coming. Obviously, with the presence of RIGI, investments in mining, the most emblematic would be copper and lithium. They will also be making a great contribution. Without a doubt, our field, always and to the extent that we can grow and lower taxes, we will go against the withholdings. And that, in addition, will allow the sector, the field, to expand more strongly. Therefore, agriculture and livestock have a lot to contribute here. And, obviously, in an economy that generates all this, it generates a lot of opportunities in terms of services. That is, it is more in an economy that for so long was eating capital. The marginal productivity of capital is high. What we see in microeconomics that looks like an abstraction, do you know what it means? That the beating of the asset is huge, that is, the beating of the background flow of the firm is huge. Therefore, in addition, if we work hard to lower the cost of capital, investments would have to flow very strongly. And then, something else we are working on intensively and especially with Dr. Rydell, is in the subject of artificial intelligence. From our point of view, artificial intelligence is like a kind of industrial revolution, but reloading. When you look at the growth statistics of GDP per capita throughout the period, from the 0 year of the Christian era until now, that series is usually described as a hockey stick. It is a series that is practically constant for 1800 years and then hits strong acceleration as a result of the impacts of the Industrial Revolution. Well, artificial intelligence is going to be that this process seems a child game because it will be much deeper, and so that artificial intelligence develops, you need to have cheap energy in cold places and with high areas of Earth. Argentina, therefore, too, but I only say this for the effects of mere enunciation of sectors that do have a huge potential, that I will not explain to you because you are in the trench and you know it much better than me, and it would be of a fatally arrogant guy to believe that I can tell you something about your business to you, which are the ones that are at the foot of the canyon. But only to mention them as cases of things that can happen and that, in fact, are happening. And then there are the impacts of the macro on the flow of funds. And there we have elements that make the short term and long term. In the short term, it has to do with cyclical recovery. At the beginning of the presentation, I talked about the use of installed capacity, how it has been uploading, and there basically what is pushing is the recovery of real wages. 5 months ago that the real salary in Argentina has been rising and that they are also uploading retirements in real terms. That is also to add the reversal of the stock cycle, that is, when we were on the end of the previous government, as a way of covering the companies were over. And in that sense, in the first part of the year they liquidated the stocks and that deepened the fall of the first quarter. And now there is a stockposure of stocks, and that is what is making cyclical recovery factors pushing positively. Obviously, that then is everything that has to do with long-term growth, and there, everything that has to do with structural reforms and what is being done in regulation. Being that our goal is to become the freest country in the world, that also implies a strong fall in transaction costs. At the same time, there is a strong increase in savings. The fact of having run to the treasury of the environment and making a fiscal savings of 15 points of the GDP, those resources that were taken by the public sector will now be available in the private sector. Not for nothing in December we discussed hyperinflation, and today we are discussing mortgage loans at 30 years, or how a company could place debt in the local market at 5.75%. Not only that, but the elimination of inflation is that prices distortion down. Inflation has a harmful effect, which is, the price system is a mechanism for the transmission of information, coordination and adjustment. If you basically have inflation, what it does is that it flows with noise. So, I can be explaining here, being very good explaining, and you can be very intellectually endowed people and understand without any problem what I am saying, but imagine that, from now on, there is noise and increasing noise. I continue to explain well, you are still very intelligent people, but the noise does not allow us to communicate. That is what inflation does with the price system, and when it does that, a lot of transactions are lost and there is a loss of efficiency in the allocation of resources. Well, our zero issuance program assures us that the central bank will never bother them. And why do I say this? Because as the endogenous dollarization progresses and that they begin to make transactions in dollars freely, there will be a time that will be very large. All the operation in dollars and the operation in pesos will be very small. And when that situation is given, we will be able to close the central bank, and that politicians never in life can fix them again with the inflationary tax. On the other hand, I am already close to finishing warning. Another thing that is very important in a business is growth. And growth, when you take empirical evidence, economic growth, there is a phenomenon called convergence. It is the situation under which a country that is lagging reaches large countries. That in Argentina could become a power in 35 or 40 years, but seriously. No, let's say, half of the table. Power. Let's see, when I speak, for example, my model looks like Ireland. Ireland of being the most miserable country in Europe in 40 years, today has an order per capita 50% greater than that of the United States. That is the world that I like. That Argentina be the country with the greatest economic freedom in the world. That will make us prosperous. So, there is a situation that is this convergence. And, in reality, when one looks at the literature of the Austrians, it is very interesting, because Hayek talked about the market as a discovery process. Then to the extent that you discover things, then they grow. Now, what is interesting? Why can those who come from behind grow faster? Because the rest of the things were already discovered by another. All they have to do is copy it. That is, many of the businesses are already invented. Do not invent the wheel, you have to bring them. Nothing else. That facilitates growth and convergence. And obviously we are generating the conditions from what we propose from artificial intelligence and from what we propose as a mechanism in what has to do in the institutional to promote a free economy, and that people can carry out their projects. And that there does take the Schumpeter place and creative destruction, which is what will later make us grow when we are at the forefront. But we have 30, 40 years to copy the beautiful and move forward strongly. Therefore, it is not so difficult. And, finally, the topic of the discount rate. As I told them, tax solvency implies a fall in Argentine risk, and that basically allows the interest rate to fall. In fact, one of the things that we were doing with Frederick deliver the fiscal numbers, but we said, well, we are going to make the account what happens if you make this increase. And what I saw that when it gave that increase in the background, there is a very interesting book called History of the Fifth Floor, and shows how after the original stabilization of the Austral, Sorui begins to, by indication of Alfonsin, to give each one a quarter to each one. I give you 0.25. I give you 0.15. Everyone gave everything. He ended up returning the fiscal deficit and ended in hyperinflation. So, what we did is the exercise of, well, let's see the incremental effect of the money that goes to universities. And we will be the unpresentable before, that is, we return to a world of 3,000 points of risk country. Incidentally, the unpresentables who had the country risk in 3000 took a lot of resources to the universities, and then they are the ones who say they will defend them. It is interesting, that is, there are those hypocrites and there are the direct jets, those who steal directly with the universities. Then, we take out the account, and in an exercise we support ourselves and cling to our fiscal policy, paying all political costs. That makes GDP at $600 billion. If we yield and return to the usual trades, it goes to $400 billion. This is interesting because, when we take in terms of resources for universities in dollars, they are constant. That is, all that increase, but in a more filthy macroeconomy, resources end up being constant. But what is the problem with a more filthy macro? First, that the GDP per capita in dollars is lower. The important thing about the fall of the GDP per capita in dollars is that it has two components. There is a component of activity drop, which is a third, but the remaining 2/3 is due to the jump in the real exchange rate. And that implies that the amount of poor and homeless increases. Therefore, as a business it was not only lousy because GDP per capita was smaller, but also implied a multiplication and increase in the amount of poor and homeless. So, when the account is so clear, the other thing that should be clear to them is that these people are not defending the university, nor the interests of Argentines. That all they want is to defend their correos and end up taking a government that forces them to work, that forces them to work decently and stop driving with politics. The other argument, and is already the last so that I am finishing, notice, is the reduction of macro volatility. That reduction in volatility is an element that provides value. If you want the sharp race shot, you are uploading. Obviously that in the perspective of real options you could say that I have less volatility, so those options could be worth less. Well, all that macro volatility that we are taking out, put all the volatility of the business, which is for you to believe wealth and not because there is a set of arrogant politicians ruining everyone's life. So I leave that volatility in your hands. Therefore, since the flow of funds rises, either because we respect the property rights, because we will not allow them to expropriate them, because basically there are business opportunities, because there is growth and because, in addition, at the same time the discount rate is falling. If I put myself as a portfolio administrator, I would say, long duration in Argentina. That is, Argentina is an asset to buy, to be purchased long. And what can be done to be bought long? Make real investments. Therefore, Argentina is an excellent business case. Now, I do want to return to the original phrase of Perque Avit, which I used to say, if I am not for me, who will be for me? That is, if I do not take care of me, who is going to take care of me? More liberal impossible. You are responsible for your own destiny. You are the architects of your own future. If you do not take care of yourself, who will do it? The state? No, because the state that can do is harm. The state produces nothing. When the state gives something, it is because it before robbed someone. Therefore, we have implemented the most liberal policy of all Argentine history. We lower the weight of the state to the private sector in about 13 points of the GDP. Because we have made the greatest adjustment in history, we have run to the state in more than 6 points on GDP. If we only take into account the treasure, so many freedoms were never returned in such a short time. Therefore, that is, if you are not for you, if you do not take care of you, who is going to take care? Moreover, and although you take care of you, you are occupied with you. The question is what I am, what they are. You are entrepreneurs, you are the ones who create wealth, you are the social benefactors, you are the ones who have the key to make Argentina grande. Again, you are the big ones, you are the ones who can change this reality. We are only giving you a smooth play field, a pitch in which you can play. We are giving you the rules of the game, we are giving you the frame, but the creation of wealth will depend on you. That is, you are the ones who will stand up to Argentina, you are the ones who will make Argentina grande again. And then, the final question is, what if not now, when? It is now. It is now because this never happened in Argentine history. But for this to endure it requires that it be successful. And this will be successful when there is growth. And the growth is going to occur when you decide to put your role as entrepreneurs and go out and win the market. And that is what will bring us prosperity to all. So, God bless the Argentines, that the force of heaven accompany us and long live freedom. Damn it.